morning and welcome to today's webinar. It's a very quick summer school session, outsourced, not out of mind. And we don't have time to hang around, so I'm just going to get straight into it here. So just a little bit about us first. We're calQrisk, Experience Risk and Compliance Professionals. We offer GRC Software Solutions, so we're a third-party provider, so we understand the concept of third parties and outsourcing and whatnot. We are based in Ireland, but we have clients across the globe in financial services, public sector, not-for-profit. In fact, all but Australia are represented today. When I was going through the attendees last night. So welcome to you all. I'll get going. So here's the agenda for today. What is outsourcing, outsourced service provider risk management, and why does it matter? When and how do we do due diligence? Who should be involved? And what is good outsourcing service provider governance? Very often in our organizations, we outsource processes or even entire functions to third parties. And the term third party and outsourced service provider are often used interchangeably. But in practice, in the regulatory world, they are distinct terms. And here on this illustration, you can see that outsourced service providers is a it's a subset of your third parties. So it's any entity outside the organization itself. Of course, we know this is third party, including suppliers, consultants, contractors, service providers. And outsourcing involves engaging a third party to perform or carry out an activity that otherwise would be handled internally. So a core business process or a function that organizations would generally be expected to have in-house. If they contract those out to a third party, that's an outsourced service then. So you'll have some third parties that provide services that aren't part of core operations and don't replace internal functions. And these are not outsourced service providers for our purposes today. So as I said, third party is any entity outside of our organization. It includes consultants, contractors, and service providers. And the definition of outsourcing is a relationship in which one party engages another party to carry out a business activity or function, rather than having it retained internally and have our own employees do it. So it's off the payroll, but we're contracting somebody else to do it. And this list here is just a list, obviously non-exhaustive list of what an outsourced service might be in your organization, be it accounting, contract cleaning, fund services, human resources, research and development, payroll, website development. These are all outsourced services. So what do the regulators say about outsourcing? So the European Banking Authority says that it defines outsourcing service providers as third parties that undertake an outsourced process, service, or activity, or parts thereof under an outsourcing agreement. So it's a very definitive definition, if you like, in regulation. So the central bank then reminds us that outsourcing and delegation, so you fund people out there, the central bank's outsourcing and delegation, they're not different concepts. It might be called different things, but arose by any other name is still outsourcing. Because in the delegation relationship, you're outsourcing functions that the investment manager, the fund, outsources it to other delegates, just like say a non-financial services organization might do. Firms cannot simply contract out their regulatory responsibilities. This comes from the Financial Conduct Authority. So they remind us that directors and senior leadership teams still play a pivotal role in the outsourcing process. from strategy to oversight to establishing policy and risk appetite. So, and the buck stops at their door. So while we can contract out the service, we can't contract out our responsibilities. So why will we do outsourcing risk management? Well, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Jerry loves a quote, so I always like to include a quote. And this one is attributed to Thomas Reid, an 18th century Scottish philosopher. So he's known for, among other things, his work on common sense. So not suggesting that outsourcing risk management is common sense, not at all, but it is integral to how we do business these days. So our chains are getting longer, they're getting more complex. You know, in systems thinking, in complex systems, the weakest link is often determined by the system's overall resilience. So if a crucial component were to fail, then that can lead to systemic failure, regardless of how strong the other components are. And to counteract this, we can build in redundancies or compensatory mechanisms, which will allow us, our organizations, to function effectively, even if one part is weak. And isn't that the essence of risk management? We endeavour to identify, insofar as possible, any potential weak points along the chain of our service provision, and then put measures in place to bypass or strengthen or replace those links before they fail. So essentially, the OSP, let's call it, risk management process, is the same as you would use for, let's call it common or garden risk management in your everyday business goings on. So this illustration is taken, you might recognize it from the ISO 31000 risk management guidelines. And it's an excellent illustration because it shows that risk management is a cyclical process, which begins with establishing the risk scope, the context, the risk criteria. And what is a little different when it comes to third parties in general and outsourced service providers in particular is that there's distance between you and the service provider that must be compensated for. And one of the best ways to do that is to establish and maintain clear and open communication lines between you and the service provider from day zero, before the kickoff, the service kickoff date. And why is managing risk so important? So there's multiple reasons why outsourcing risk should be a top priority for your organization. And three of the most important are to ensure compliance, to ensure accountability is met, and to protect your brand reputation. So outsourcing arrangements are growing in scale and complexity these days, with an increasing percentage of critical operations being managed by third-party providers, often located in different countries. So they present cyber and privacy risks, business continuity risks, digital operational risks, concentration risk, geopolitical factors, and supply chain risks. You might think your outsourcing solves one problem, and it probably does. Otherwise you wouldn't be doing it, but it does invite a lot more risk in the door. So they have to be managed properly. So this slide is not like the others. So it was created by our CTO, Jared Joyce, and he used it in his webinar, How to Conduct a Third-Party Risk Assessment, back in July 2022. And because we're so limited on time this morning, and because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I pulled it out of the archives. This is a very good illustration of what we should be thinking about when identifying outsourced risks. We should consider the outsourced service provider as an extension of our organization. All compliance obligations connected to the outsource activity need to be documented in the contract and service level agreement. And I want to pick out particularly here this relationship. So this sub-outsourcing risk here. So regulators remind us that the practice of sub-outsourcing can make the effective management of outsourcing risk difficult, as the parties may be, and generally are spread across different physical and geographical locations. We could also develop a dependency on a sub-outsourcer without being aware of those dependencies. So we need to make sure that we're notified of any existing or planned sub-outsourcing. And we need to ensure that's cemented into our contract. Concentrations can develop in respect of sub-outsourced providers, which we may not have sight of. So concentration risk is a factor. And taking guidance from the central bank, in order to manage these risks effectively, we should establish our appetite for sub-outsourcing and document it in our outsourcing policy. We should use our contract in SLA to manage associated risks. We should treat intra-group outsourcing risk, including sub-outsourcing, in the same way as we would treat equivalent risk arising from externally outsourced services. And we must ensure, that at a minimum, the outsourced service provider oversees and manages the activities of the sub-OSP to ensure that all services are fulfilled in line with the original outsourcing contract and SLA and compliance requirements. Bearing in mind as well that those of us who are subject to DORA have a regulatory obligation to manage the risks associated with these fourth parties, which is another term for subcontracted parties. So when should we do due diligence? At every stage of the outsourcing life cycle. So initially we carry out research that informs the strategic decision to outsource. We complete a risk assessment and cost benefit analysis. We allocate budgets and other resources to support the strategic decision to outsource. And what happens next? So as I mentioned earlier, the outsourced service may be critical or important to the delivery of your own client expectations. And because of the distance, you have to put a lot more effort into managing those off-payroll relationships. So during the procurement process, whether tendering or otherwise, you will carry out initial due diligence, information about the organization. Are they financially sound? Do they have a good reputation? Are they a right fit for your organization? How is their compliance? Do they have insurances in place? What about their business continuity arrangements? Is there a sub-outsourcing chain relationship that's related to the delivery of your service? And if so, how is that managed? And then during onboarding, so we're going to be communicating our policy, our procedures, our service level expectations, finalizing our contracts, including termination clauses, and agreeing the kickoff date for service. Then throughout the service provision, we'll be doing ongoing due diligence, doing spot checks, carrying out site visits, conducting audits. You'll be monitoring service level agreements and key performance indicators. So the personnel who manage the relationships, the outsourced relationships, will do much of this through internal or external due diligence. They'll document incidents, near misses, good catches. These will build up a profile on the service level agreement delivery and where it might be slipping, giving you time to fix it before it breaks entirely. And then contract end. So you'll be doing a review, which will inform whether you want to or are able to renew that contract, or whether you're going to offboard the relationship and all that comes with that, then data return continuity and all of that. I've put this slide up as a list of due diligence criteria. Now, it's not exhaustive by any means, any stretch of the imagination, but it's just criteria which you should be thinking about when drafting those due diligence questionnaires. So you'll have it in the slides, which will be provided later. So we won't go through them right now. Just conscious of time, we've gone a little bit over, but there isn't much left. So the due diligence key stakeholders. So who are they? Ultimately, in line with corporate governance, the board and senior management team are ultimately responsible for due diligence on outsourced service providers. But day to day, this is carried out by staff, depending on the stage in the life cycle. So it might be the procurement team at the beginning, the outsourced service provider relationship managers during the relationship. They might delegate to business function team leaders who might further delegate to team members. but the team members, as I said, are critical. They're the people using the service, and so they'll be able to pick up on where the service level agreements are not being met and documenting those. So what is good OSP governance? So as with any governance, you need good oversight mechanisms, you need an informed strategy, robust risk management, robust due diligence, a clear and documented outsourcing policy, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, regular monitoring, open communication, and periodic reporting. And I've put in a final slide here about the future of outsourced service provider risk management, because the European Banking Authority currently has a consultation paper out for review. So they released it on the 9th of July, and it's open for consultation until the 8th of October. So in that, they note the increasing reliance on third-party service providers. And some notable recommendations from that is that we need to change how we think about the traditional notion of outsourcing. So instead of as I just described, outsourcing as a subset of third parties, all forms of third-party reliance should be managed proportionally, obviously, depending on their criticality or importance. And one other thing of note was that a register of all existing third-party arrangements should be maintained, which will fulfill both DORA requirements and future EBA expectations. So that's it. There are some useful links, and we'll leave it there. We'll be sending out the slides, as I said. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm just going to open up and see. We have one. So where you outsource to a service provider that has a separate external service provider dependency, where does our business resilience requirement end? Do we get attestation from our service provider that they have contingencies in place if their service provider fails, or is there a requirement for us to reach out directly to the fourth party, our service provider's service provider? Okay, so if you can be confident, well, first of all, if your business has an appetite for maintaining an outsourcing relationship that includes subcontractors, then the next step is, is your due diligence robust enough, and are their arrangements sound enough that you can have confidence in that fourth party's ability to determine that your service will be provided. At the very least, you should know about them, because under DORA you're obliged to, but in general you don't want to suddenly have concentration risk that you didn't realize you had, and the fourth party fails, and so your first party can't deliver the service, and that gives you problems then in continuity of your business delivery. So the answer is, it depends. It's very nuanced, but depending on whether it's a regulated entity or not, or a regulated activity or not, that will determine how far down the chain you need to go. So there we are. We've a little bit over. There don't seem to be any more questions coming through, so I let you go back to your days. And hopefully the weather will be as sunny as it is in the picture you're looking at right now. And all the best. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.